Okay, so we're going to look at graphing these, and we're going to need to label all the things that we've learned about in the parabola, which would be the directrix and the focus and the vertex, and then get some points on the graph to make sure. Usually we look for the x and the y-intercept if we can. And so we're going to go through and talk about how to do that. So the first thing we need to remember is what our general form of a parabola is. And so notice on this one, we have the y squared point. And so that is going to be one of these that opens up left to right. And so our general form for that is x minus h equals a times y minus k squared. The key thing is we need this x term to have a coefficient of 1. And so the part that is not squared, which is the x term, needs to have a coefficient of 1. And then we need to solve for that on the one side. So we manipulate this equation so that we get 4x equals negative y squared by subtracting y squared. And then divide through by the 4, and we get 1/4 or negative 1/4 x equals negative 1/4 y squared. Well, remember that a is always going to equal 1 over 4c. And so in this case, we get c equals, and I like to think about it as -1, and we'll talk about it in a second, what that means in a second. And so you could also think about it as c equals 1, and then just know which direction you need to go based on the negative sign. And so we'll come back to that. The first thing we do is we look at the vertex. And remember, the vertex is the hk. Well, in this problem, the hk is just 0, 0. So we know our vertex is at 0, 0. We've got the y squared, and so that means that we're opening left to right. And because c is negative, the c value is defined as you add the c value to the vertex to find the focus, and then you subtract it to find the directrix. So if c is -1, we add that to this point to find the focus. And so in our case, the focus is just going, so our vertex is 0, 0. And since c is -1, our focus is going to be -1, 0, because we're going to add, we've got to open to the left because it's a y squared and it's negative, or you can think about adding -1 to the x coordinate. So the directrix then is going the opposite direction, and it's going to be x equals 1. And so you get x equals 1 here. And so it's going to look like this. We know that there isn't, the y-intercept is just, and the x-intercepts are just 0, 0. Now they're the same, and so that doesn't help us any. So it would be nice to have a couple points. And so I'm going to look when x equals -1, then you get y squared equals 4, and so y is 2 and -2, and so that gives me a couple points to kind of consider here. I could also look at x equals -2. In that case, you'd get y squared equals √8, which is 2 √2, which is somewhere between 2 and 3, and so it is something like this. And so our parabola looks like something like this. Okay, it opens to the left. It has a vertex of 0, 0, which we need to label. It has a focus of -1, 0, and a directrix of x equals 1. All right, for the second problem, this one's a little bit harder because we don't have it in a nice vertex form. And so what we do on these is we get the squared term by itself with its other variable. So y squared plus 6y, if there is a 6y or some sort of y variable. And then we get everything else to the right side. And so that's going to equal 4x plus 7z. And then actually we're going to make this one. This should have been... No, that's correct. We're good. Okay, and so then we're going to, on the left side, because to get it in the vertex form, we have to have that squared term, and so we need to complete the square on y squared plus 6y. So we do that by taking half of 6, which is 3, and squaring it and get 9. And so this is going to be plus 9, which means on the right side, we also need to do plus 9. So that's going to give me y plus 3 squared equals 4x plus 16. But when we're doing these, we have to have the x coefficient be 1, and so we're going to divide through by 4, and we're going to end up with 1/4 y plus 3 squared equals x plus 4. So just like the last problem, we know that the c value is going to be 1 because the a, the part that is the coefficient of the squared term, is always 1 over 4c. And so c would equal 1, would give you 1/4. And your vertex is going to be x is negative 4 and y is negative 3. And so you get negative 4 over, negative 3 down. C is positive this time, so we're opening up to the right instead of the left. So our vertex was negative 4, negative 3. And our focus, well, we're just going to add 1 to the x-coordinate, and so it's going to be negative 3, negative 3. And then our directrix is going to be 1 in the other direction. So it's going to look like that, and it turns out to be x equals negative 5 because you go 1 more to the left in the negative direction. And then this one we can find some y-intercepts. If we let x equal 0, we would get y plus 3 squared equals 16. And so y equals negative 3 plus or minus 4 when you take the square root of both sides. And so that would give you a negative 7 and 1. And so it turns out that when x is 0, y would be negative 7 and 1. And so that gives us a good idea of what our graph's going to look like. And so it's going to look something like this. You could also plug in 0 for y to find out what that x-intercept is. That would be pretty easy. It turns out it would be 9/4 minus 4, so negative 1 3/4, which is about where I drew it in at. So vertex negative 4, negative 3, focus negative 3, negative 3, directrix x equals negative 5, and then that's a good looking graph. All right, so we do the same thing here on 3. This time we have the x squared term again instead of the y squared being there. And so we get the y's on one side, so we get x squared minus 4x. And then on the other side, we're going to have negative 2y minus 1. Completing the square, half of negative 4 is negative 2, squared is positive 4, so we're going to add 4 to both sides, and so that's going to give me x minus 2 squared equals negative 2y plus 3. But we want the y coefficient to be positive 1, so we divide everything by negative 2. So that gives me negative 1/2, and then x minus 2 squared equals y minus 3/2. So our vertex for this one is going to be 2, 3/2, right? It's always the x-coordinate is the one that's with the x, and the y-coordinate is the one with the y. And our c value is going to be negative 1/2, because we would do negative 1/2 equals 1 over 4c, and so it gives you negative 4c equals 2, so c equals negative 1/2. So when I plot my vertex, it's 2 over and 3/2 up, so right here in the middle. And then since c is negative 1, that means it's opening down because you end up with this negative value in front of the x squared term. And so my focus is going to be just right below, 1/2 units exactly below. And so the focus turns out to be 2, 1, which means the directrix is 1/2 above. And so the directrix turns out to be y equals 2, right? So my directrix is here. You always want to dash in your directrix. And it's y equals 2. And then the graph, well, if I go through and try to find the y-intercepts, I'd let x equal 0. And so I'd multiply through by negative 2 and get x minus 2 squared. Y was 0, and so it would be equal 3. And so it'd just be 2 plus or minus root 3. Well, root 3 is around 1.7. And so it turns out to be about 0.3 and about 3.7. And so the graph of my parabola looks something like this. Okay, you got a focus of 2, 1, a directrix of y equals 2, a vertex of 2, 3, 3, 2. Those are the most important things. And then try to find at least a couple other points to make sure you get a good look at what your graph should look like. All right, for the last one, on this one, because the square root is put in for you, you have to remember that that's always positive, which we know that y then has to be greater than or equal to 0. And that's going to be important for us when we do this graph. So to graph this, what we do is we just square both sides. So that gets us y squared equals x plus 3, which is now in a vertex form. So our vertex is just going to be negative 3 comma 0, because there's nothing with the y squared term, and then we just got this 3 here with the x, so we do the negative of that. So negative 3 comma 0 is our vertex. And then we could find the y-intercepts by plugging in 0 for x, and so our y-intercepts are going to be plus or minus root 3. But y can't be negative, and so it turns out that it's just a parabola, but it's a half parabola that is just the positive part. And so it ends up looking like this. You don't need to go through on a problem like this and find the directrix and the focus. All you need to do is get a good idea for the graph. And again, one of the real big keys is recognizing, what does the square root tell us? And the square root is always positive because of the principal square root. So you should be able to recognize that means that if square root of x plus 3 is positive, then y must be positive.